people's lives. So the great thing is that Africa is a continent that has lots of challenges. And I often talk about what I call the 7 grand challenges that Africa has this century and the 7 great opportunities. The challenges are big problems that we have to fix in Africa. So these are things like urbanization. We have 800 million people who are moving to cities in the next 40 years. When you start thinking about that, then that opens up all kinds of questions about, okay, how are you going to do the urban planning for these cities? How are you going to think about the architecture, the real estate development, sanitation, water, etc.? Nigeria has a backlog of about 20 million homes, but they're only building about 150,000 of those every year, right? So if you think about that, then suddenly the person who's able to come up with a solution to build low-cost housing can become a billionaire, and you can also really change lives. Another big challenge is healthcare, education, infrastructure, governance, youth unemployment, and climate change. These are all big, big challenges, but on the other hand, they're all opportunities which are waiting for an entrepreneurial solution to solve, and in doing so, we can create jobs and we can create change on the continent. On the other side is what I call the 7 great opportunities. And these are things where we have been blessed as a continent, and where we sort of have very low-hanging fruit. So these are things like agriculture. We have the largest amount of arable land in the world that has not yet been cultivated. We have plenty of rain, plenty of sunshine, but yet, we import about $40 billion of food into the continent that we can grow here. So if you think about all the agribusiness opportunities that exist, where you can apply technology to improve yields and add value to agricultural products, we should be feeding the world. Another big opportunity is in tourism. And then if you think about what can happen through the empowerment of women, that's another opportunity. Another opportunity is in how do we manage our natural resources, like the oil and gas and diamonds and gold that we have? How do we think about arts, design, and culture? There's a lot of creativity in Africa, and that's a big opportunity to leverage our creativity to create a creative industry that we can actually sell to the rest of the world. I think there's also a great opportunity with regional integration to bring our economies together, etc. So these are all blessings that we have as a continent, right? And it's up to this generation to say we are going to become problem solvers and actually take each of these, everyone pick one problem that they want to solve, and in so doing, we can create jobs for ourselves, and we can create jobs for other people, and actually bring the continent up into prosperity.
Thank you so much for that take, which is very holistic on the current situation of Africa. Ms. Semal, I have been following the conversations, the debate around whether industrialization should take place in Africa, with the need for to be more cautious of green economies, with the resources that we're trying to work through. How does Africa position itself today on the global market? And perhaps you could share some of Ethiopia's own experiences, having a couple of years of good GDP, good development every year. Yeah.
I think part of the liberation or the industrialization of Africa is something that we've been sort of waiting for in earnest for some 4 decades now. And for those 4 decades, we've been following advice that largely resembles actually what my friend said just now. Let's not focus on the government, let's not focus on the state, let's focus on entrepreneurs, let's focus on, let's live, and I mean, the ideas that the West has been selling are as strongly argued by the West as they are, for example, by South America or South Africa or my brother here. So I think we have to start. I think the liberation of Africa in terms of the economy starts with the liberation of economics. I think it begins globally. We need to liberate economics from neoliberalism, right? So this idea of competitive markets being a panacea, the introduction of competition into our economies and into our political structures as being a panacea for all our problems, I think really is an idea that needs to be examined. I think in Ethiopia we had for I think about a good 2 decades done the opposite, but we're very much following what are the neoliberal prescriptions over the last 5 years or so. So it's a lot of liberalization, privatization, a focus on the competitive market. If you look at things that we've done, for example, in agriculture, it's about getting rid of marketing boards. It's about reducing state intervention in the market. Now, our exports have actually decreased over the last 5 years. Our exports are now lower than they were at 2012 levels since we started following and industrializing a model for industrialization that has been sold to us, like I said, for some 30 years. So Ghana is probably the best example, the most successful African example of the neoliberal reforms. If the measurement of success is development, Ghana falls very, very behind, right? So the very best example, if the very best example falls short from what we want, then I think we have to start examining the ideas that we've been following. And I think it's not an African problem, right? So you see it in America, right? Competitive markets have now essentially made the US a failed state, right? They've lost global hegemony to the competitive market. So if the competitive market is capable of making America a failed state, it can only be capable of creating many failed states in Africa, and it has created many failed or failing states in Africa. So to me, the economics of liberation for Africans begins with the liberation of economics from neoliberalism.
Thank you for your intervention. I think we'll come back to Fred to see how the two live together, because I think models have to apply from country to country. And going to you, Janine, you wanted to have a comment on the economics, while also connecting what the role of diaspora is evolving into. Africa has had a huge diaspora for many years. For a long time, it's been about brain drain. So huge talent pool living in the diaspora. But Africa is now ready to get diaspora involved. What does that look like?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Yes, I wanted to comment on the economy and actually to bounce back on what Simhal just said. Maybe just to make us all aware of what we mean when we speak about Africa and Africans. We are a population of 1.3 billion, and the median age is 19, which means that your typical African is 90-year-old. I don't think we often picture that when we speak about Africans. And 2/3 of us are, I think, younger than 30. That is also Africa and Africans. So when we think Africa, Africans, liberation, economy, we should think this demography. And whichever liberation, whichever achievement we want, any progress will have to deal with this demographic dynamics. And I want all of us to be very much aware of that. That said, I am extremely optimistic about the continent. I am extremely, as an economist, if I would speak as an economist, I'm bullish about Africa. If we are this young and we have this youthful continent, it means that future markets, whether they are competitive or not, future markets lie in Africa, nowhere else. And that's also an immense reservoir of not only markets, but resources. We speak often about commodities. What can we do? What can we get from them? But what are we getting from our main resource, which is our youth? So in that, I said that I wanted to bounce back on what she said as an RPF member. I think one of the foundations and the main to beat it. How does it impact the African I talked about, like the typical African? So in that sense, there's much room for the debate she brought in and the context we live in, which is globalized, which is liberal, which is competitive. We also are Africans in the world. We don't live in a bubble of our own. Coming back to the diaspora and the fact that I pointed out the demographic dynamics we are into, there will be and there is an increased demand for all kinds of services. Financial services, obviously, education services, healthcare, so there is a niche there. And I don't like very much the term diaspora. I think we are just Rwandan communities. We happen to live in different countries, and some of us holding different passports. But the idea of Rwanda has always been big. We say Rwanda Rugari. We often refer to ourselves as the Intara ya Gatandatu, so the sixth province. The Rwandan communities abroad are very much part and parcel of what is happening inside the country. We are consulted, our advice and feedback is sought after, and actually, I could give examples in the room, but there is much of brain gain towards the motherland. So Rwanda is a study case for what communities abroad can bring to the country of origin. Wherever we are, wherever a Rwandan is, it is Rwanda. So for us, it's as simple as that. And I want you to remember how maybe you follow, people in the room follow too. I know that fellow Africans do follow Rwanda Days. They have become an institution. At least once a year, president comes to any other country where Rwandans live, and we flock from all over to be there. This shows that something is happening, not in Rwanda, but the leadership of Rwanda is inspiring not only Rwandans abroad, but Africans abroad. I mean, I always go with fellow Africans. There obviously is a humongous momentum for Africa, and our role is manifold. Maybe we will develop it later on. But the one thing I wanted to emphasize upon as we open the discussion is the demographic dynamics, and the second is brain gain. There is a transfer of knowledge happening. I do believe it will keep happening. And as we speak about transformation, transformation is impact. The previous panel I was following keenly spoke about growth and the fact that growth may not translate right away to livelihoods improved, but impact is not like an instant thing. It's accumulative. If the right policies are put in place, if there is delivery capacity built, impact will happen. We are seeing it here. We are 3 women and 3 men on this panel. Women are well represented in Rwanda. It's not a random thing. It's a policy that is now impacted, and it shows. So when it gets to the continent, if we put together the right policies and we emphasize on delivering it, impact will happen. And as I said, the future markets, whether they are competitive or not, they lie in Africa. So much to do.
Yeah. So the African diaspora or the African communities living abroad are looking to Africa to continue to invest and work in Africa. This brings me to the conversation around what the place of the young, educated African is in the current struggle. And I'd like to take it back to you, Fred, because you are investing into educating young Africans. And you have a strong emphasis on helping them understand the African context and take on leadership. What do you see will be or should be the place of the young, educated Africans?
Well, I think ultimately education is what converts this massive potential that we have, which we keep talking about. We have a young population, we have, we're soon going to have the largest workforce in the world, 1 billion people by, 17 years from now. That's not a long time. So people talk about a demographic dividend, but it's only going to become a demographic dividend if that workforce is somewhat educated and has skills. So education for me is what converts this tremendous wealth that we have on the continent, which is not, as James mentioned, it's not the gold and the minerals underground. It's really what we have in our brains. And that is what allows us to innovate and to use our ingenuity, our creativity to create goods and services that we can sell to each other as Africans and that we can sell to the rest of the world at higher prices and use that to invest in and develop ourselves. So unless we can educate in a short period of time, create our own wealth so that we can pave our own roads and educate our own children and feed ourselves, we're sitting on a big time bomb. So that's why I think that if there's the single biggest challenge for this generation is job creation. And the way we're going to do that is by educating ourselves and becoming more innovative so that we can employ ourselves and employ others.
So the jobs of the future are going to be created through education. Thank you very much. Thank you for that intervention. I want to tie it into African integration, and I'll bring that to you, Lonzen. Thinking of the way that Rwanda has opened up its borders for Africans and also the world. How do you see opportunities arising, and what will it take for us to actually integrate economically?
Thank you very much. I think, all right. I think, first of all, let me talk about the problem that I believe Africa is facing. I think that the main problem that Africa has faced or is facing over the generations, since we're having a conversation about cross-generational dialogue. So I think over there's been this inability to overcome the paradox between paradox of deprivation. I mean, there's plenty. So Africa has plenty of resources, but there's also high levels of deprivation. So this paradox is really at the core of Africa's problem, the inability to overcome it. And I'll come to the question directly. And the reason that this paradox exists is because there has been this absence of the development of a critical mass around a clarity of purpose. So until that critical mass is developed around a clarity of purpose, Africa will not overcome this paradox. And so we have, in political terms, we have 4 generations. We have the generations of the nationalists who won independence, so 50s, 60s. So I'm talking to you how this paradox has reproduced itself. So we have the 70s and 80s. We have a neo-colonial military dictatorship that is actually an indirect recolonization of Africa. So Africa is independent from the 60s, but it is recolonized in the 70s and 80s, but indirectly. It's not a direct colonization, but it's colonized. Africa was under colonial rule for the 70s and the 80s. It's just the people don't really say it that way. But it is a proxy colonization through military dictatorship. So the 90s, we have, that's when we have the liberation, the generation, the young people. The young people who are fighting back against this proxy recolonization, and that is when they win liberation, and that's where the RPF is able to liberate Rwanda. So now, when we talk about the passing of the torch to the next generation, we're talking about the generation that is coming after these youths who liberated them. So we are talking about a youth that is coming, that is replacing, that is coming to add on the achievements of another youthful generation that delivered liberation. So that is why countries like Rwanda, we are talking about a new Rwanda. That is the context of understanding what a new Rwanda means. A new Rwanda means the ability to have in place a leadership that has a clarity of purpose for the first time in the independence of the country. And I think this is very significant. So now, so the next generation now, its objective is to draw on these achievements, the foundation that they have, that for the first time they have in place a foundation that has a clarity of purpose upon which they can build a critical mass able to transform not only Africa, not only Rwanda, but to provide leadership to the rest of the continent, which now leads to your question about integration. That's the leadership I'm talking about. It's about driving the critical mass that sees the importance of African integration as a means of providing dignity to the rest of the Africans. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that insightful perspective on the way Africans are now taking on a new role, especially in terms of economic liberation. I want to tie it back to this celebration that we're having, which has been the celebration of the RPF that liberated the nation, has reconstructed Rwanda, and is building hope, and is a model. Rwanda is
for some of these arrogant, self-ingratiating young people who want everything now without paying any cost for it. And the pain of living with the two. The generation of President Kagame, Mugabe before him, and Nyerere before Mugabe was a generation that understood the importance of ideology as framing struggle. That it was not activity, not even productive activity, not even political activity, but it was the ideological frame that defined the purpose of activity. Otherwise, all this activity just became an expenditure of energy without a necessary outcome that's sustainable. So what we've ended up with in Zimbabwe is a liberator generation that, after having liberated, achieved phenomenal development. Some of the most educated people, great education system, great infrastructure. You could tick many boxes. In 1996, the World Bank said Zimbabwe was the best performing African economy. But herein lies the problem. The danger of liberation is not in failure, it's in success. Because when you get to success, imagination is often limited. Because people begin to become complacent. Leadership becomes self-ingratiating. Leadership begins to feel entitled. So after the success, we started looting. We started ensuring that now that we had political liberation, economic liberation meant for the liberators that you have more cars, more wives, more houses, more children, and everything else that comes with it. So, in essence, the progress made was chowed by this moment of success. And for the young people, it is important to remember that although you do not see the imperial force crouching at your door, the imperial force never left. No country, the generation of President Kagame, President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni and co. understood this. Their Pan-Africanism was born out of necessity. You could not liberate Uganda without the solidarity of fellow Africans. There is a generation that is born today whose Pan-Africanism must be born out of imagination. You cannot create enough jobs in Rwanda to employ all the Rwandans that need jobs. You cannot absorb all the Zimbabweans that need to be absorbed in Zimbabwe. So Africa needs to open up, broaden up. The one imperative. The liberator generation did not need to invest that much in innovation in science and technology, because at the time the principle and the onerous task before them was to get the yoke of oppression off our necks. This current generation cannot develop purely by wanting to sell things. When Americans have gone to the moon and others have gone in deep sea water, it seems to me that the imperative for this generation is to leapfrog everyone else, not only in entrepreneurship. Because we speak with American accents and we dress up and think we are on TV, and we watch the TV and everything is globalized, we miss the one small fact. No civilization has ever sustained itself and dominated the world without projecting its own values. The Rwandan experiment is about this. Let me end by saying, when I grew up, I used to watch Chinese movies. So when I first met Chinese people, I thought all of them could walk on walls and do kung fu. But hearing this is what helped ingrain in our minds that a civilization must project itself first as capable. A civilization must project itself to close the gap between ideal and performance. That we cannot sell that much ideology when there's no performance to back it up. Ideology has to be backed up by lifestyle and performance. In Zimbabwe, the failure was this. We kept the ideology, we lost the lifestyle, and the state stopped performing. Africa will not transform simply because we're functional businesses. We've got to get the African state to catalyze and enable development, but to act as a guarantor when the market fails. Because if we don't have a strong state, any enemy, anyone wanting to take advantage of Africa will do so at will. So a strong, democratic, strategic state is not an enemy to Africa, but a strong citizenry that is driven not by the need for jobs only, but the need to create those things that will shape the future of the world. To be globally competitive is an imperative that this generation of young people cannot miss. If you don't have an ideology to become the greatest world force, then your ideology will lead you into slavery as a footnote in world history.
That was a powerful intervention. Thank you so much, Kagoro. And I want to invite Janine to say a few words around the values that you carry as a Rwandan who is working in other parts of the world, and how you bring that, how you carry it even with African communities who aren't as connected to their home countries.
Can you hear me? Yes. It's a good question, and I think it's one that I keep asking myself. Am I, as a Rwandan, relevant to my fellow Africans, neighbors, the place I live in Geneva or where I travel in Africa? Are we having a conversation? I would just share maybe the experience we have, at least in Europe. For a long time, probably because the communities were made of people in exile, our culture was our country. So basically, speaking Kinyarwanda, dancing, being together was home. So for us, culture was home. It was not even questioned. It was like for a fact. And in that sense, it has really gave us a strong foundation, I would say. And now the beauty is the country we have now is now home, and there is this back and forth exchange. The young people come here in Ingando. I can testify of my young brothers, nephews, nieces, cousins coming back from a month here and really being transformed. And I think this was one of the geniuses of this country, this idea that Rwandan youth from all walks of life, from all countries and backgrounds, meeting and spending time together with the leaders, and effectively were passing on the baton. They would sit with the generals in the room, they would sit, President Kagame would come. That was really, I think it's one of the geniuses of the system, having a moment where young people from everywhere receive the same food, the same education. That kind of, it's a strong foundation. So that's one thing that when they come back, we speak the same language. They speak the same language as the people here. So how do I relate? How do we relate with other communities? As I said, it's an ongoing process. Lately, we have been doing more things to kind of build ourselves, creating stronger structures, coming up with ideas of our own that then we share with them. Let's say it has been interesting to receive feedback from other Africans. Obviously, they look at Rwanda, and I don't think there's anyone here or outside who is not kind of passionate about Rwanda, either positively or negatively. Rwanda does not leave people indifferent. So we have faced both situations, strong and harsh criticism and like incredible optimism and exuberance. And it has taught us many lessons. I would say we have learned most from our... And one thing that I want all Rwandans, either here or abroad, to live with is to never be happy about the misfortunes of fellow Africans. Our fate is common. So as much as we want everyone to be cheerful about our successes, we should feel the same compassion and concern about what's going on in other places. I was concerned when I was watching the news and when President Mugabe was leaving. I was telling Brian as we were sitting there, it's kind of odd to see the former colonials, the Brits and the Zimbabwean cheer for the same news. They had the same level of enthusiasm and joy for the same news. It's a bit odd. It is as if we had, as he said, no memory what President Mugabe stood for. As much as he had his shortcomings, what he stood for is still valid. So it's kind of bizarre. I'm very active on social media to see fellow Africans mocking President Mugabe. I want that to be un-African. I want all of us to outgrow the habit of belittling, criticizing, at least outside, fellow Africans. And that is a great lesson we learn when we are abroad. Because if someone misbehaves, they won't say, oh, she's Rwandan, oh, she's Ethiopian. No, just Africans. So in that sense, we owned the mistakes of the rest of the community. That's one big lesson, aside from, as I said, the Ingando being really the laboratory of future leaders and leadership. I had another point. I don't remember it, but it will come back. I had another point.
Okay, we can come back to that. Thank you so much, Shani. Tying back to the conversation around the need for a strong state, a state that's leading development, I would like to get interventions from both Samel and Rugira about what that state looks like and how young people get involved and play a role in the forming of the state or sustaining the state.
Should I go?
Please go first.
I think how you join a state is to become a civil servant, I suppose. But I think more than just, it's the type of state, it's the nature of the state. I don't think it's necessarily a strong or weak, big or small. I don't think that's the discussion that we should be having. I think it's the nature of the state. I think perhaps the kind of state capture that he described of Zimbabwe in the early 90s is what happened in Zimbabwe is you had an interventionist state, you had a strong state, and you had things like a strong education system. And the timing of like you said, 1996, there's a 1994 World Bank report that comes out with prescriptions on Africa. And the timing is not accidental. The Zimbabwean state becomes a swollen state, right? So it's a big state with no ideology and a competitive market. And what happens is wives start to compete, people get bigger cars, and so on. Now, the timing is not accidental, and the consequences are not accidental. We've seen the same thing happen in Kenya. And there's very interesting economic debates, the Kenyan debates that were happening in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and you see the exact same thing happen there, right? So there's the rolling back of state service, there's NGOs coming in or entrepreneurs coming in to do what you would traditionally think is a state education. Traditionally, you would think that's the state's that's within the scope of a state's work, right? That's the type of service that a state delivers. What's happening now is it's NGOs under the guise of entrepreneurs that are being forced to provide the services that traditionally a state would, right? So I think that's what happened in Zimbabwe, and we've seen it time and again, and I believe that we're seeing it in Ethiopia now, right? So the IMF has just come in, competitive markets are a go, and when I say there's a very strong connection, we've talked a lot about innovation. And there is an institutional context to innovation. Innovation doesn't just happen because I feel creative that day and I'm going to draw a rocket and it's going to turn itself into a rocket that flies into space. That's not how innovation occurs. There's an institutional context to innovation. Those institutions do not exist in Africa. The state has to build them. Right? As a young person, as a young 19-year-old German, and as a young 19-year-old Ethiopian, I do not have the same access to institutions, research.
Tajuddin predicted that if you put a ship to the coast of Africa and you offered Africans an opportunity to go to the West to be slaves, that they would fill the ship, they would go to be slaves. Now, this is less than 10 years ago that Tajuddin said this. Tajuddin is a Pan-Africanist. Why is it that he is able to predict what just took place in Libya a few years ago? When Tajuddin said this, many people thought he was exaggerating. This tells you about the governance environment that young people are going to be growing in, and whether they are going to choose to contribute in shaping it or to flee it. Now, it is also not a coincidence that among the young people who were rescued in Libya, there's not a single Rwandan. It's not a coincidence. If you start to see the young people who were rescued from Libya, you look at the countries they came from, there's a pattern about the environment, governance environment in their countries. It is also not a coincidence that Rwanda is the country that went to rescue them. Now, it's not the case that Rwanda has more opportunities for young people than all these countries. It's not the case. What is the class invested in the future of their country, and they're unwilling to take those kinds of risks or to flee their country, so they are building their country. About the particular policy environment in which they play a part, if you look at policy design in this country, from the whole policy cycle, from the design to implementation to coordination, you see young people. There's a lot of consultation that takes place in the formulation of any policy in this country. In fact, it will not pass if it has not been exhaustively passed the consultation process. It will go to the Prime Minister's office, and they will tick off the sections of the population that should have been consulted. If we have not consulted this category of population, they'll push the policy back for further consultation. And I know this because I do policy designs. I've written some policies. So this is an environment in which that young people feel that they are consulted about the direction that their country is taking. So now, when you talk about the overarching policy environment, we are talking about a context where there is, on the one hand, ideological clarity about the purpose for which the state exists, in which the young people find themselves. On the other hand, you find a strong accountability system, measures that complement the ideological clarity, and as a result, when you bring back the participation of the people of the different categories of society into that calculation, you find that it is an environment that is conducive for every section of the population, and that it feels invested, and that there is a sense of common purpose in the country. Now, there is one area see, these are the basics. Now, when you go in each of the other countries, they'll talk about these things, but they'll not do them in practice. The extent of the consultation will be very deficient. The extent of execution capacity will be very low. But the accountability measures that complement the ideological clarity ensure that the execution capacity is very high and that there is strong accountability where there is a failure of execution. Now, because these are basics and because Rwanda takes them seriously, Rwanda is shifting. It is going away from the basics and it is moving into another area that many other African countries are not even begun to tackle. And this is another area. It's about the public finance management. So the resources that you have, how do you manage them in such a way that they bring optimal results for the population? So that, because the basics are taken care of now, those basics are just pointed out, they are taken for granted. It is as if it is for granted that people should be consulted in the policy that affects their lives. So we've taken those things for granted. So now we are shifting. We are shifting into another phase to try to get the most outcome out of the resources that we have.
Thank you so much for bringing that perspective as a policy developer and designer. And while I invite the audience to prepare your questions and your comments, I'd like to quickly pull out the key points that were raised in this conversation. If you have a question, please raise your hand and our protocol will get to you. So we've discussed ideological clarity, the need for ideological clarity, and the place for imagination, the place for memory in this new phase of liberation. We've discussed the place for an educated younger generation of Africa and their role in fighting the economic liberation, which is our new struggle, the place for identity in nation building, and the need for state-driven development. So I'm going to invite the protocol. Let's start with someone on my right. Please introduce yourself and be brief and concise.
Thank you very much. My name is Gatete Nyiringabo. I am a lawyer and an African storyteller. I'm going to start with an anecdote. If you think a fellow can't sing, all you have to do is to call his music a hellish roar. I'm saying this because I've been sitting in this room and listening to the amount of wisdom about the struggle of African liberation movements. But since these African liberation movements were created, internet has who went through the movement. And one of the ways they were enabled to preserve the spirit of the liberation, for instance, the RPF, people, they tell us that culture and upbringing at home and tradition was able to preserve the idea to return to Rwanda someday, and that's where they drew their courage to come back. But today, those frameworks, those platforms of education, of incubation of the youth are no longer valid today, because those who know, those who have the spirit of the liberation are not in as much communication with those they are transmitting the values of the struggle to, because those to whom the transmission of the struggle is today are on the internet. And on that platform where they draw their information, African elders are least present. There's a saying in Kinyarwanda, ngutaganiriye na se, hamebyo sekuru yasizavuze. He who has not spoken to his father will not know what his grandfather said. Now here we are with our fathers, with whom we're supposed to be speaking, yet we are accessing information from someone else's father, whose father was actually an oppressor of my father, whose my father fought and liberated themselves from. So I am being colonized, I'm the son of a freedom fighter who's being colonized by the same colonizer of my father. So my point, to wrap up, all this brings me to the idea of my wish today at RPF 30. My wish is that we Africans start thinking about an African media, a media that defines what African heroes are. We must not wait on this platform. They were speaking about the economics. African 18 years olds, what do they buy? From which market do they go to? If I started producing African products, would they buy them? Who will expose my African products? My father, just last example, my father, having been a navigant, he used to go with timber and gold and cocoa from African ports to Europe and come back with second-hand clothes and second-hand cars and fridges that are used, the ones that Kigali protocols that don't allow anymore, to Africa. And Africans were more excited about the junk that he brought than Europeans were excited about the precious minerals that he sent them. Because our definition, our bioethics, our definition of what's good, what's beautiful, is defined by those who are selling the products to us. We can't stand our ground. Thank you.
Media to educate the younger generation.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I see a hand right behind. Thank you. Let's try to be concise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Arthur Asimwe, and I'll have one straight question to Mr. Kagolo. Now, when you look at the story of liberation movements in Africa, I think somewhat the story is a bit depressing. Because, like you rightly say, they start off well, with very good values, with very good political intentions, but along the way they seem to be hijacked by individual interests. And the story is cutting across Africa, especially when you're looking at the different liberation movements. Now my simple question is, what lessons should the RPF, that today is celebrating 30 years, draw from this sad story of the past liberation movements of Africa that have not lived to the expectations of the Africans? Thank you.
Thank you. Your question was to Kagoro. We'll take 2 more questions before getting back to the audience. Yes.
Thank you. Irakiza Henry Israel. I'm the student at University of Lay Adventist Kigali. Munyeshuri said that we Africans shouldn't be happy with the misfortune of fellow Africans. And this reminded me of the statement made by the former president of Tanzania, Kambarage Nyerere, where he said that if the house of your neighbor catches fire, he meant these traditional houses, Nyakatsi, which we no longer have in Rwanda. He said that if the house catches fire and you feel like it has nothing to do with you, then what you want, I want to ask the panelists and people who are here, do you feel contented with the reactions of our African leaders to the problems that are across our nations and these countries in Africa? I'm asking this because of what happened even in Rwanda, because we suffered 20 years back. Genocide was taking place in Rwanda, yet the world was quiet, and fellow Africans. And so my question is, are you contented with the reactions of the African leaders with what is happening across the continent? Thank you.
Thank you. I will look for a woman. There's someone right in front. Can you move the mic to the lady? Please get, yes, thank you.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Odette Nyiramirimo. I'm not a member of RPF. I've been invited to this conference, and I'm very, very grateful. Yeah, I'm representing Liberal Party here. So the question I want to raise is about culture. Because even in the first panel, the culture was talked about. And what I'm thinking is that culture should be dynamic and is dynamic. Now, if we say culture is the foundation of transformation, I agree. But what do we do to make sure that culture also goes in that transformation that we are talking about? When we look to what is happening in many parts of Africa, we see many practices that are very harmful, even to development. And I'd like to ask if there is someone who can comment on that. How do we also drive that transformation in our cultures that are, of course, a good foundation for economic transformation, but that the culture also be in accordance with the time today, and our youth are also in good line instead of always looking back on what could change in that culture. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable, for the question. I will.
Could you please be more specific? Because she seemed to convey the message that sometimes a culture is too static and not dynamic, and maybe it would be nicer to have a specific case.
Okay, we'll invite her to have the mic if she's willing. If not, I think. Okay. Yes, I think the question is clear, and we can find a way to. You can find a way to respond to it. We'll start with the questions addressed to you, Mr. Kagoro. A question from Arthur Asimwe asking what lessons the RPF can draw from other liberation movements who have not sustained the gains.
I wrote my thesis in 1994 on the Rwandan genocide. My best friend for many years was a young Nigerian called Tajuddin Abdurrahim, who died on his way here. We met ahead of the Pan-African Congress in Kampala and argued so badly. Actually, ironically, we hosted President Kagame at the AU summit in 2006. No other head of state other than President Kagame and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf would come and talk to citizens. But an interesting thing happened that after the main meeting, we stood having tea and had a robust exchange of views. Let me start there. I think that the struggle from ANC to CCM has not just been leadership alternation. It has been leadership that is ideologically consistent, ethical, accountable, and can perform. And I wish to underscore this. Liberation movements have had these people, I call them movement divas and movement gigolos. They can talk up a storm, they are going to this populist narrative, this charismatic, non-performing charlatans. And this is exactly part of the fundamental problem in liberation movements, that the definition of what constitutes leadership beyond the ability to give a good speech, and understanding the ideological frame of the movement. Number three, understanding the imperatives, both historical, current, and future of the. So what RPF perhaps everybody keeps talking about succession, Mugabe should have. No. I believe that in a democratic movement, I mean, succession suggests that you hand over to someone. In a democratic movement, the democratic process will enable leadership that performs. So this results-based leadership is what we negated in most of our liberation movements. We started rewarding longevity, we started rewarding age, we started rewarding loyalty, and we forgot that loyalty would not be able to continue the legacy of performance of delivery. Without performance, agitation by citizens would grow. So the first lesson is you can be handsome and beautiful, you can have articulate speeches that you are able to make, but the fundamental thing that any liberation movement must keep in mind, leaders must be chosen because they are able to unite the movement, the internal cohesion. They understand the policy coherence and ideological consistency. Number 3, they are able to perform, right? The ability to buy people, to buy young people beer, to appear like you are closer to the people. I think that any movement that wishes to survive has to curtail that kind of stuff. The third thing is that the capture of movements happens second. You see, when you are powerful in any movement that runs a country, donors, companies, everybody wants to be close to you. So it so happened that the enticement of proximity to the West or the East and the powerful caused many to veer away from the party line. Once they have external guarantors and guarantees, they no longer need the consent and consensus of the internal party mechanism, because they can use the external guarantors to subvert the democratic process of the movement. So if there's anything any movement must deal with, is this mortgaging of the future of liberation by international connectedness. The third and last thing, the movement always seem, after they've performed very well, we are seeing it in the ANC, to get to the stage where we start using region, class, old schools, little things that were anathema at the beginning of liberation. We recede back into very atavistic, tribalistic, sometimes regionalistic politics. Now, here is the lesson for RPF. All our movements actually built great economic units, companies. But we were so trusting that we left the companies in the hands of individuals that we believed to be loyal. In the meanwhile, in our trust, they built empires within the movement. And the movement was subject to hijack from internally by people who had become wealthy running the financial arms of the... And they had used that access to create jobs for their boys, for their girls, and before we knew it, the entire movement had been hijacked from the grassroots to the top. I think, Madam Chair, the lesson for RPF is this. Ideology is important, diplomacy is important, knowledge and research is one thing that's capital, but investing and educating the youth is much more than making speeches to them, right? Much more. I think that we invested in defending ourselves against the external, but we didn't invest sufficiently in defending ourselves in the other liberation movements against the internal rot, the ideological backsliding, and the capitulation on fundamentals of the values of the party. There is an opportunity, an inclusive movement, an open movement. Openness is not the same as nakedness. That every opportunist who didn't come when RPF had no money can now come that RPF is a sound governing party. Openness and nakedness are not the same. There should always be a test to leadership. Do you believe in what we believe in? Do you live it out in your values? Do you walk the talk? Madam Chair, the last thing is on culture. I think that culture is dynamic, yes. Culture must be made. But sometimes I get frustrated as a Pan-Africanist. How many of you are familiar with any negative components of American culture or British culture? Right. But Americans don't spend half their time talking about the negative. Each time I say culture, people now think I'm talking about FGM. I'm talking about, no. Components of our culture. Did our culture have things that are negative? Yes. Should our culture be modernized in certain instances? Yes. But, my friends, Twitter, internet, and social media are tools. Like any other tool, a hammer, a shovel, the tool does not define identity. If a man blames the tool for lack of identity, such a man is dead.
Thank you, Mr. Kagoro, for your intervention on those. I do think we need to have another comment on media, because media is pretty powerful, and it's what our young people access today. And I'm going to invite Fred to speak about why we should, the comment that was made by Gatete, so I don't influence your position. Please.
About media, yeah, I think it goes into what Brian was saying, is really that ultimately we need to control the stories that we tell about ourselves. Right now, African stories are too often told by other people. We don't, we need to think about how we build our, and celebrate our African pride, and really project the Africa that we want to see to ourselves and to the rest of the world. Because part of development, I really believe, is driven by how you see yourselves. And I think too often Africans are being influenced by negative stereotypes and images that we are seeing on CNN and Al Jazeera and so forth about ourselves. And it's not building our self-confidence enough to actually be able to take the leadership that we should be of this continent, of the rest of the world. And so I do think until we invest more and build our own media and can tell our own stories, we will have Africans walking around with negative self-image of themselves. And that isn't liberation.
Thank you, sir.
And let me just also comment on the, what is, I think this question about, whether African leaders are doing enough to, support each other. This is one place where I think that there's a gap between the rhetoric and actual implementation and performance, as Brian was saying. Because leaders get together at African Union and they talk about, they sign protocols and, they take pictures and so forth. But then when you look at practical, tangible things that are happening to actually facilitate Pan-African identity, Pan-African collaboration, those things are not there. So it's very hard for many Africans to travel across the continent because they can't get visas. We're doing very little trade with each other because we have so many trade barriers. We do only about 15% of our trade is intra-African, whereas 85% is happening in the rest of the continent. There's xenophobic attacks happening in countries like South Africa and so forth. And we're very fragmented. When we go out to the rest of the world, we're not coming together as a continent. Our economies are individually very small, but if we bring them together and we're going to negotiate, we can then control the prices of the commodities that we're selling and so forth better, right? So we can negotiate on the political front better, etc. So, and part of this, I think, really also boils down to the education that we have historically had and that continues to happen. A lot of education systems in Africa are modeled after the colonial power, and many people learn about, I remember growing up, a lot of the in geography class, you'll be learning about wheat farming in Iowa, and people are reading Shakespeare and Chaucer. You're not reading African literature. You're not learning African geography. You're not learning about your neighbors. And many people come out and they don't understand the content. So, for example, at the African Leadership Academy, when we bring students together from all across Africa, and they come, that's the first time that they're actually being exposed to African literature, African politics, African geography, and so forth. And so we need to change, and this goes part to really decolonizing our minds. And until that happens, we're not, it will remain talk. And it's exciting to see that countries like Rwanda are actually moving beyond talk and actually making an example of what it means to be Pan-African, with President Kagame's leadership of the African Union, with the visa-free travel for many countries in Africa, with talent being able to move across. That's what we need to see across the continent if we're really going to be able to rise together.
Thank you very much for your intervention. We'll take another round of questions, only 3. Any people with burning questions?
A Pan-Africanist and a proud cadre of RPF. My first question goes to Brian. Brian, as a lawyer and a writer, I would like just to ask you, African young people, they look around Africa and they're afraid to get into politics. What are the catalysts you think can push them to take the initiative to get in politics and change things? My second question goes to Rugira. You, as a person who is, in a way, experienced in politics, I would like to ask you, is there a way you can just tell us some important obstacles which was encountered by the African leaders, which we can learn from as the future leaders and improve on what we are going to do as leaders?
Let's keep it to that. Thank you.
And my last question, the last question goes to Swanika. We had Lumumbas, we had Sankara, we had Kwame Nkrumah in hard days. And today's, as we are at least in good days, we get some leaders who are worse than them. The things is, they are inversely proportional. When we have bad times, we have good leaders. When we have good times, we have bad leaders. What do you think caused that? What is the cause of that? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. There's yes, on that side, I can see you. The mic on my left, Ingrid. Yes, please pass the mic.
Good evening. My name is Helena Batoni, a graduate in Politics and International Relations. And my question is addressed to everyone on the panel. Now, not all African countries are lucky to have leadership that teaches the youth and encourages them to understand their country's ideology. Now, my question is, what is your advice to young Africans whose leaders are not ready to pass on the torch or have refused to pass on the torch, yet the young people are ready? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And then one final question, the gentleman in blue, who is already standing.
Thank you. My name is Joseph Ayimana. I'm a medical student. I'm Rwandese from University of Ujitwe. Basically, my question is oriented to Fred, who is basically in the education system. If you see in like youth liberated, there's a problem of education system basically from colonial system up to post-colonial period. If you see there is a problem for unemployed youth Africans, this I think is caused by because the system created for them, it is not fitting with the job market for Africans. Like, for example, there is a student who attend the schools and finish the senior 6 schools without job. While you have like WDA created in Rwanda, the student finished senior 6 schools and directly get the system of getting jobs in the system for the, like VTC and some other activities help them to get job in facility ways. So why right now we cannot create this education system which is fitting with African market on job system? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. That's all we'll take for now, and I'm going to. Oh, okay. We'll take one more question. Yes.
Thank you, the moderator. Honorable Vice Chair, the SG of RPF, His Excellency, protocol observed. Dear members of RPF, good evening. I'm Patrick, I'm Vitero Patrick. I'm from University of Tourism, Technology and Business Studies. I would like to share with my fellows Pan-Africanists on the panel, because I saw that they didn't discuss exhaustively about the achievement and why we are sitting here, the anniversary of RPF, especially regarding to the youth of Rwanda. And I hope the youth from other countries, they can learn from us. We're heading to. So through Itorero, the youth of Rwanda will learn a lot, history and different things which can help us in the transformation, but as well as in leadership career. I will talk about cadreship sessions which are being taken in different universities, and as RPF is an engine of the government, but as well as Pan-Africanism in Rwanda, which is Rwanda chapter. I will talk about RIAF, Rwanda Youth in Agribusiness. There is so many platforms and incubation centers which are put in place to enforce, to empower, and to engage the youth of Rwanda so that we can take part in the transformation of our country as well as transformation of the whole Africa.
Thank you, Patrick. I'll give you one more minute. Yeah.
The last one will be a question. In Rwanda, Pan-Africanist movement has been established from the national level up to the village. But we have a challenge or a constraint that outside of Rwanda, other countries of Africa, how far with Pan-Africanism spirit? Because we understand that Pan-Africanism is an ideology which is about mindset change, ideological. Thank you. So, my dear Pan-Africanists from Zimbabwe, I'm coming straight to you. As the youth from Zimbabwe and across Africa, we have learned so many things in Rwanda, especially about preserving what we have achieved. But now, our elders or our leaders, they are fearing that.
Patrick,
they are fearing that after, there won't be a generation which will take over what they have achieved.
Hello?
What they are
Hello. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I don't mean to interrupt, but we really need to get it moving.
Thank you, Patrick, for your intervention. That was insightful. If I may have your attention again, I'm going to invite our panelists to respond to some of the questions raised. And while we do, I would also invite you to say your final remarks. We have 1 minute each. Yeah. So there was a question on African youth and their role, leadership, yes, education and leadership. And then there was a question on the succession of leadership in Africa, the education system, matching jobs. So I will invite you panelists to respond to it while also giving your final remarks.
Well, I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is, who are we as a people and what are our aspirations? Once we know that we have a value system in place, and that value system is conscientiousness, so we are conscientious about who we are as a people, and then we build in our entire society, all our sectors around a critical mass to express that conscientiousness. So the question is about that conscientiousness, which is very important for the person who, so in the area of education, for instance, there is one of the prominent journalists in our region here, Ulimwengu, said that Africa is the only place where you have people who study biology but no biologists, people who study chemistry but no chemists, people who study physics but no physicists. Now, the question is, how do we build an education system that brings this conscientiousness about who we are as a people to express into the young people who go into our education systems? The same thing with the media. If we build conscientiousness about who we are as a people across all sectors, if you go to the media, journalists, are we building a critical consciousness, a critical mass of journalists who are able to express who we are as a people? Today we have a narrative that dominates in journalism, and that narrative is to who are we? So we have to build a journalism that is able to express our values. Finally, if I stay in the area of journalism, the front line in journalism against the African is in the area of democracy, in the area of human rights, in the area of freedom. This is the front line upon which the pathologization of Africa is taking place, where the African life is not valued, where it expressed in terms in which is derogatory. So as a journalist, how do we take our journalists on the front line where the African life is destroyed, is devalued, is made second class? So that is my main concern. My main concern is about looking at all African life and building a critical mass and expressing the African values, African value system in ways that we think represent who we are as a people and our aspirations. And the leadership question, I think, takes care of itself from there.
Thank you very much for that intervention. Kagoro, yes.
President Kappa, is he still here?
Yes.
President, I would like you to challenge these youth. They are on Facebook and on the internet. Please, you can Google, as I speak, the OAU 1963 very first conference resolution. It had three things: UN reforms so that Africa can have representation, building a Pan-African media that would tell stories according to Africa. Number three. So, since 1963, we've had this realization. I don't know how many of you were born in 1963. They have a saying, Madam Chair, that if you keep doing the same thing over and over again and not getting a result, it's a sign of genius. I want to go to what my sister said about ideology. Take a little bit from, because our continent moved from left, loony left, extreme left, to center, to right, to extreme right. But let me borrow a leaf from Karl Marx. Marx suggested that he or they that own the means of production control the mode of production. They control the relations of production, and they control the outcomes of production. So, before the coup in Zimbabwe last week, the politics, as you know, that Mugabe stood for, was always that Africans must own the means of production so that they're able to control the mode of production, the relations of production, and the outcome of production. Now, I don't know how many of you remember the 1980s, but I know some of you are too young to remember. They used to train people to type 60 words per minute. Now today, your child who didn't go to secretarial school can type on the phone more than 60 words per minute. So I'm wondering what school you would have taken them to learn something. Now, this idea sounds attractive of educating for jobs, but that idea is in part correct. The other part, it is the most retrogressive idea. Do you know that doing computers was a sign that you had failed in education in the 80s? Eh? If anybody said to you, I'm doing computers, it was not a sign of genius. But today, if anybody says, I'm in ICT, that shows they are top-notch thinker. The shifting notion of employment and of market and of opportunity all depends on who is controlling demand, supply, the market, and production. I would like to disabuse any education system in thinking that it can, in this fourth industrial age, necessarily be able to educate anyone for the market. We don't know what the market will be in 5 years' time. We didn't know, and here is something people don't know. In 2000, they had this thing called Y2K. We didn't know, we thought the world was going to end or Jesus was going to come. But anyway, we thought all computer systems were going to crash. But in 2000, we were not half as conscious of the internet and social media. Madam Chair, I want to suggest to you as I close the following. Young people, your role is not only to enter politics and represent. Your role is not only to be in Rwanda. Your role is to be representative of Africa, in Africa, beyond Africa. They are, in this day and age, must learn. We are not educating or training people to be national players only. We are training a globally competitive African who will take African values to dominate the rest of the world.
Thank you so much for that intervention. Janine, I'll invite you to say your remarks.
It's hard to speak after Brian, but I will try. And I will go somehow in his, I will follow him. I have left it for, I kind of forgot a point I wanted to make before, but my point was the scarcity of imagination. He pointed it out before I spoke about it, and somehow he's coming back to it. The jobs of the future, we don't know them. But we know the needs of today, and what builds imagination is to believe that you matter, that what you think is important, that your view of the world matters, not someone else's. So we should never be waiting for someone to give us the mic, for someone to agree or disagree with us. We tend to be sometimes like kids, waiting for the next award and being happy about it. The scarcity of imagination is something we have to address on a way deeper level. Rugira spoke about consciousness. It is consciousness. But believing that we matter, that what I think matters, that my view of the world matters, that that who I am matters, is foundational. It's the beginning of everything. But this generation of Rwandans today, they have a strong foundation for that. I'm pretty sure, and I'm ready to bet with anyone in this room, as I said before, the policies have been laid down, implementation has happened. We will see things happening that will surprise us. I want to bet on that. And I hope that our parents and the leaders who came before us will be surprised about the innovation that the young people here will bring about. It's bound to happen. I don't see the way it won't happen. It's bound to happen. So I'm still very optimistic. But the freeing of imagination is still something that needs to happen. That needs to happen.
Thank you, Janine.
I'd like to start commenting on actually something that you said earlier and he just said. I think you mentioned that it's a globalized world and it's a liberalized world. So and it is a globalized world, and globalization in part is an exchange of ideas. It's an exchange of systems of governance. And I think if we look at who is now, right now it's globalization with Chinese characteristics, right? That's what's coming in. And I think if we're looking at exchanges of ideas, if we're looking at globalization as a means of bringing in institutional technologies, earlier than, I'm sorry I'm blabbering, but I'll give you an example. Switzerland allowed for universal suffrage. That is, the women in Switzerland got the right to vote in 2 cantons in the early 90s, right? I did not have to wait that long as an Ethiopian woman to get the right to vote. But my level of growth development is not that of Switzerland's when I got the right to vote, right? So we can skip steps by learning, and we have to choose who we learn from. And I think there are now options. We've seen what happens when you introduce competition into the economy, when you introduce competition into political life, and perhaps I think also going back to what he was saying about our liberation movements getting hijacked. I'm picking on the Republican Party because Dr. Tendai Fraser is here, and she's probably my favorite Republican, but I think it's something similar to what has happened with liberation movements in Africa. What's happening with the Republican Party and American politics at large is something of the crisis that had been the crisis that had been in the periphery, that is in Africa, in South America, in Asia, has now gone to the center, both in terms of the economic crisis and the political crisis, right? So there's a political economy that is capable of turning the Republican Party into a situation where the president is asking for personal loyalty, something that you were talking about earlier from the FBI, right? So I think we have to talk about the political economy, the types of political economy that hijack our movements and the type of political economies that allow our movements to grow and to develop. Does it include things like education systems or good education systems, right? There's types of capitalism. We have options. We can be China, we can be America, or best case scenario for me, we can be Denmark, right? So I think there are options. We have to look at these options free from ideological control, and that ideological control is neoliberal, right? When we're talking about people losing sight of pragmatism and of growth for ideology, I think that's to me is the Clintons, that to me is the Blairs, right? And it's being salvaged by the Corbyns. So
Thank you, Samar. Fred.
Sure. Let me see if I can comment on 2 questions that I was asked specifically. So the one is about how do we think about education in a world where there's, few jobs and where there's a lot of uncertainty and so forth. The way I think about it is that education systems in Africa definitely need a lot of reform, and to prepare us to create citizens who are not only going to be competitive in Africa but globally. In my mind, there's kind of 4 elements to that. The first is education institutions really need to be, the purpose of education, I believe, should be, firstly, to learn how to learn, right? Rather than learning anything specific, it's just learning how to learn so that you can keep learning and reinventing yourself as the world changes. So that's the first thing that I think education institution needs to do. And the second thing is delivering skills that will always be relevant even when machines and automation becomes increasingly relevant, right? So things like, how do you communicate? How do you lead yourself? How do you lead others and work in teams? How do you manage projects? These are things that will always be needed. And how do you understand emotional intelligence and so forth. The third thing is to imbue in people a sense of problem solving. So once to get people to understand the problems that society faces and develop the ability to solve problems, and education systems should be training problem solvers who are general problem solvers so they can keep solving new problems for the future as they emerge. And finally, I believe that education systems should be developing certain traits and habits in people. So things like passion, things like hunger, things like grit. These are things that will make you go through all the obstacles in life, and that will give you the kinds of drive and hunger to create change and to either create your own job or to be valuable to an employer. So and I do think that given the huge population that we have, the expectation should not be that someone's going to give you a job, but really think about how you're going to use your own ingenuity and innovation to create a job for yourself. And so that's the way I would think about that. And then the last thing I'll comment on is the question about, which is, I noticed my fellow panelists all missed or dodged, this question about why do we have good leaders during bad times and bad leaders doing good? I've never actually heard that characterization before. So let me try and see if I can answer, share a perspective on that. I think perhaps maybe what happens is that during all leaders need a cause, right? They have a cause that they're fighting for. And so perhaps during bad times, say, in a liberation struggle and so forth, the enemy is so clear that the cause is very clear and the cost of failure is very high, right? And so that creates discipline. And it also, when there's a crisis, it forces clarity. Clarity of purpose, you know exactly what you need to do, and there's very little margin for error. And I also believe that the people who are being led are also much more intolerant in such circumstances for when people are not performing. And so it forces performance because there's very little room for error. But in good times, well, there isn't really a clear, there's no enemy. We've got all the time in the world. You don't need to focus. You don't have that discipline. And so therefore, maybe that's how these leaders that started out being good end up being bad. And I'll close and relate to that. They say that, to achieve something great, I've heard this saying that says, to achieve something great, you need two things. One is a plan and not quite enough time. And I think that's what happens in bad times, is that you don't have enough time. You've got to have a plan and you've got to make it happen. And I think as we look at this era that we're in and the new generation that we have, this is where we are today. We need to make a plan because we don't have enough time.
Thank you very much, dear panelists. Thank you, Fred, for your final words. This has been a very interesting conversation. Your perspectives are appreciated. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, and all protocols observed, we thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation. I'm going to hand over the program back to us.
Wow, that was a very insightful panel we just got here, as the first one also. And I want just to remind you this was live on YouTube and on the RBA, so in case you just want to revisit what have been said here. But also on Twitter, there were a hashtag RPF30, so in case you want to remind yourself whatever you liked, you can search on Twitter or on YouTube. And one thing I've noticed during the whole day is this conversation is a journey. It talks about a journey in which elders have to train the younger generation. And in this journey, we have to be innovative, disruptive, confident, proud of our culture and selves, and also be disruptive in when we face challenges, because today we live in a global world. It's no longer just about Rwanda. It's about Africa. It's about the world. So whatever we try to work on will have consequences in the rest of the world. And my favorite quote today is the wisdom words we've got from His Excellency former President Mkapa, where he challenged us to align our actions with the so beautiful words we just mentioned in this room. If we can really have our bodies execute what our minds express so eloquently in this room today, then we will be a better Africa. So, Diana, The program is yours.
Thank you very much. And the program is the end. I'm not going to speak too much. I think we've covered everything. I don't think there's any need for interpreting everything that has been discussed this afternoon. Your reaction was speaking for itself. So we hope you've enjoyed this conversation. And we should all remind ourselves that the conversation continues. It must continue. Enjoy your evening. Thanks.
abari bakurikiye televiziyo Rwanda, abari bakurikiye inama mpuzamahanga y'umuryango FPR Inkotanyi ikaba igeze ku musozo. Ni inama mu by'ukuri yagarutse ku bitekerezo, kungurana ibitekerezo ku cyarushaho kubaka uyu mugabane no kuteza imbere. Inama rero ikaba yaranzwe n'ibiganiro bibiri, cyabaye mu masaha ya mbere ya saa sita, cyagarutse ku kwigira kwa Afurika, kubaka ubushobozi ndetse n'uburyo bwo gukomeza gusigasira iba byaragiye bigerwaho n'uburyo bwo gushyiraho ingamba zihamye zo kunga ubumwe ndetse no gufatanya hagamijwe kwiteza imbere. Ikiganiro kimaze kuba muri aka kanya